Hi, I'm Advas Saldinger, and you're listening to Devex at the World Bank and IMF meetings, a special edition of This Week in Global Development. Every year, in spring and fall, finance ministers, civil society organizations, and private sector financiers gather at the World Bank and IMF meetings to discuss the state of the global economy. With this year marking the 80th anniversary of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, a key question is whether these institutions are still fit for purpose given today's global challenges. Join us as we explore that question and share key insights from the meetings. After the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors met in Washington, D.C. this week, I caught up with Achim Steiner, the administrator of the United Nations Development Program, to get a readout of some of those conversations and talk about coordination between multilateral development banks and the United Nations, the broader global financial architecture discussions that are ongoing, and much more. Here's that conversation.
The spring meetings, both of the IMF and the World Bank, always provide the context also for the G20 meetings that happen here. And in particular, finance ministers and central bank governors are always a good litmus test for what is the take on the global economy, where are the biggest risks, and where does the world, in a sense, have to be proactive. I think the somewhat sobering realization is that also with the reports that were coming out just before the meetings, that the world is, in a sense, seeing the pathway to recovery in an aggregate sense, but not as fast and with more uncertainty than perhaps people even thought a few months ago. Interest rates are not yet coming down, inflation remains stubborn, and I think in that sense we are beginning to see a divergence also in the way that particularly developing countries that are not amongst the emerging economies but are in the low-income countries, the least developed countries, beginning to get very concerned, because the longer this high interest regime continues, the more their resources are being drained. And we now know that there are well over 50 countries that actually have net transfers out of their economy to service debt. And in UNDP's analysis, we have dozens of countries that spend more on servicing their debt than they actually spend on the health sector or education sector. We have also not the kind of foreign direct investment happening. So countries that are still in recovery mode after the pandemic are actually stuck. And at the same time, if you look at the larger global economy through the G20 lens, you can begin to talk about soft landings. So it's a difficult moment for a collective understanding of where to move forward. Debt is persistently still an issue that neither the G20 nor really the IFIs have been able to find rapid enough and significant enough answers to. So that's, I think, the context within which a lot of discussions are happening here. And on top of that, two issues have, particularly in the G20 context, emerged as very prominent because of Brazilian's presidency. One, climate change, and the other, poverty, and how climate change actions and development actions are actually able to be really framed as a joint agenda into the future.
So tell me a little bit more about what you heard in some of these discussions. Do you think there was progress made? You sort of talked about the challenges around the debt systems that are out there. I don't think I've heard a lot about much momentum on the debt front, but where have you seen, any progress? What things do you think are more stuck?
Well, let me put it very bluntly. The G20 economy does not believe that the debt problem of the non-G20 economy of the world matters in terms of global financial markets and stability. And therefore, given all the preoccupations right now across the G20 economies, there is simply no appetite to tackle an issue that is becoming chronically problematic to many developing economies. So there is a failure to act here, and it is beginning to also disturb, let's say, the confidence that countries have in precisely the instruments and institutions they created for these sort of situations. Now, I think where we are seeing also a heightened level of, let's say, more engaged dialogue is around the climate and development side. I think if you had come 10 years ago to a World Bank-IMF meeting, you would not have seen finance ministers engaging throughout these days here on climate-related issues, and particularly how a climate-oriented set of actions are ultimately also going to be economic development-oriented actions, whether it is on energy security, on job creation, on economic growth. And I must say I am, in a sense, reassured how much climate change has become part of the finance and financing conversation now.
So I know that the Brazilian presidency has laid out some ambitious goals for the sort of broader discussions around global financial architecture. And I think a lot of those discussions to date have actually been around World Bank, MDB reform, and things like that. Obviously, there's bigger questions. There's questions around taxes. There's questions around banking regulations and things like that that could make a real difference in financial flows to the world's poorest countries. Where do things stand on some of those issues?
Well, if an economic historian were to write a book maybe in 2035 or 2040 and look at these years now, the early 2020s, I think what is interesting is that, in part through the lens and the discussions that come through the governance of the IMF and the World Bank, two fundamental challenges to not only economic prosperity but also political stability have finally arrived in the mainstream of financial and economic policymaking. That is inequality and sustainability. Imperfect as the progress may be, and 2 steps forward, 1 step back, there is no question in my mind that when you look at how inequality is now being addressed through the G20 presidency, I mean, we're talking about a tax for the super rich that was presented at the São Paulo meeting that Brazil convened for the finance ministers, central bank governors, in February of this year. We saw Esther Duflo being invited by the Brazilian G20 president to present a $500 billion proposal to raise the kind of financing that is needed, both through taxing the super rich, but also an increase of the corporate tax that is currently being adopted through the OECD track. So I think it is very interesting that these taxation issues have now become of such relevance and of such materiality, if you want, that they're actually being negotiated globally. And so is climate change, the sustainability threat. And just as we meet here, we have seen just a few weeks ago in all 4 corners of the African continent the hottest days ever recorded. On the way here, many went or tried to go through Dubai and saw, the Dubai airport essentially shut down and flooded. We are living in a world where increasing the cost of inaction, the famous Lord Nicholas Stern narrative, is actually beginning to be measurable in financial terms. And I think this is why we are seeing the centerpiece of financial governance moving forward. But very important, it is both a lens through which to look at what can be done, but we should also be clear, the IMF and the World Bank are not the world's financial system. And where we are increasingly seeing the debate move also is the question, how do you move beyond the kind of IDA or IMF-related financing instruments and actually look at a positive opportunity agenda, mobilizing private capital, incentivizing new markets for investment. I think the next 10 years, the frontier of, let's say, public policy making will go far beyond the financing as such and far more about how to leverage public finance and instruments, fiscal policy instruments, regulatory frameworks to massively increase the incentives for private sector, private capital investment. And then the challenge, which is where always we in the United Nations keep on also drawing the attention, it's not just in the aggregate numbers that we need to measure that, because if 80% of that investment goes to maybe 20 countries, we are yet again back in the 20th century of growing inequality for those who are being left behind.
If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already working in global development, or maybe you're thinking about carving out a new path in the social impact space. Regardless, we all need a little help sometimes in our pursuit of a happy, fulfilling, and impactful work life, whether you're actively searching for a new role or looking for some pointers on how to strike a healthier work-life balance. I'm Justin Sablich, Devex's careers editor, and each Friday in the Career Hub newsletter, I'll bring you inside the minds of leading career coaches and recruiters to help you navigate the next step of your professional journey. You'll also have access to the latest hiring and salary trends and a weekly dose of the best leads from Global Development's largest job board. Visit devex.com/careerhub to subscribe.
So On this point of sort of leveraging private sector, one of the things that UNDP has done is helped countries develop INFFs, or Integrated National Financing Frameworks, which are essentially frameworks for financing national development priorities. And you've done that exercise in a lot of countries now. We're hearing, as part of MDB reform, the multilateral development banks need to work better together, maybe through country platforms, so there's sort of a clear set of shared objectives. Can the INFFs help provide some of the foundation for that? How do you avoid duplication of efforts? Countries have already spent a lot of time working on the existing things. I think often one of the things we hear from a lot of these countries is that they're being asked to do these same things over and over.
Well, you've put your finger on a major dilemma, and I think one of the things we do have to address right now is how do we get away from institutionally driven plans and platforms that essentially simply either duplicate or do not necessarily represent the perspective of that country. If you're writing your national climate strategy or financing plan with a template of how to borrow from the World Bank or one of the regional development banks, it's not going to be the same as a nationally determined contribution that articulates a pathway to 1.5 of your country, written out of your reality, your possibilities. So I think we have two challenges right now. How do we get away, first of all, from reducing, so to speak, the financing lens to that of the MDBs, and therefore the MDBs are, in a sense, the only transactor, so to speak. And I think this is where the experience we have gained as UNDP and the UN system in working on the INFFs, these integrated national financing frameworks, they were on offer to countries post-pandemic and in the midst of a financial and growing debt crisis to say, can we help you to look at all your financing possibilities, public, private, concessional, non-concessional, domestic, international, and help you frame an investment strategy that reflects your national development priorities and your particular national realities. In less than 2 years, we've had over 90 countries invite the UN to help them with this, and that to me was a very big surprise. And I think there's in part that expression that an INFF is a nationally driven analysis. A second example I want to cite, which I think is going to be particularly critical in the next few months, the nationally determined contributions. By the time the world meets in Brazil for COP30, countries will have had to submit a new NDC. Now, if you're going to have multiple parallel processes that simply do not take a nationally determined contribution, which is a country's sovereign expression of its commitment to act on climate change and how to invest in it and what kind of investments it needs from others. If each institution, or let's say a multilateral development bank lens, starts not building on that but creating a parallel process, I think we would be wasting a lot of resources. We can build on these different instruments, but let's go back to where we all are committed, whether it's the World Bank, the Inter-American Development, the African Development Bank. In the bank world, you call it client, we call the member states. It's the countries that should drive this process, whether it is climate change or whether it is an investment strategy. It's the only way we're going to get these issues into the mainstream, because these are fundamental development choices countries will make. So yes, I am concerned. I do sometimes regret that we are clearly struggling to have these two institutional pathways build on each other's offers and ultimately take countries in the choice they make more seriously.
I asked him how these efforts are playing out amid a difficult aid environment where donors are pulling back funding.
I think at the global level, we have seen, let's say, more a tendency to look at crisis countries where, an MDB cannot work, and then it, in a sense, funds some humanitarian work. But the perhaps more concerning underlying trend is that we are seeing, on the one hand, ODA decrease. Let us remember, the OECD says it has grown, but it has grown only in the sense of the total number. Ukraine alone got 68 billion last year. In-country refugee costs amounted to well over 30 billion. So we're already talking about 100 billion never being accessible except in one country and the countries of origin where the money was initially allocated to ODA. So it is a very serious moment. We have a record replenishment of IDA, which the Secretary General and I and many in the UN have fully endorsed, because we do believe it is a way in which we can bring more liquidity, more financing to a particularly critical moment for many developing countries. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a zero-sum game. So we do indeed have to work more with one another. We have to leverage more each other's capacity, and we also have to sometimes invest together in the countries we serve. And I think ideally that should be an intentionality, but I think we still have some way to go.
I also asked him what he makes of the leadership of Ajay Banga and the World Bank reform efforts thus far.
As somebody who also leads a large organization, I have a lot of respect for how Ajay Banga, I think, has first approached what he himself has called the plumbing of the institution. And I think there have been many significant steps that he has taken, from its mission or mandate right through to business processes. But as he himself has said, that has now given him the space, so to speak, in which to begin to think forward on significant increases in impact. We have made a commitment in UNDP to be part of enabling 500 million people to gain access to affordable clean energy. And we have set ourselves a target that is sooner, but it was a moonshot, in the sense that we wanted to change the way we do a lot of our work by integrating the objective of access to affordable and clean energy with broader development objectives. But I think all our institutions now must ultimately be able to demonstrate that we are able to scale up significantly. This is a moment for surging, not for experimenting, not for piloting. Otherwise, we are not fulfilling our role.
One other question on sort of Ajay Banga's leadership at the bank. What more do you think the bank could and should be doing as part of this reform process? So, you know, a lot of these changes, this plumbing is probably necessary to make the bank more efficient, but what's next? What does the bank need to be in this next era of development?
Well, look, my respect for Ajay Banga as you know, a colleague and president of the World Bank is not to now tell him this is what you should do in terms of running the bank. I think he has himself laid out a very ambitious strategy, which is centered around the reconfiguration of the bank as a, let's say, better bank, and then the objective of the bigger bank. Now, I think both are laudable, but let us also be clear, and he would be the first one to agree, I think the bigger, better bank is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And I think here will come perhaps the greatest test of the kinds of reforms and changes he is putting in place, and that the board has asked of him to do, and that the world is also looking to the bank to not do singly, but to lead, in a sense, in a community of multilateral financing institutions, that is, how to better leverage private capital. We do need to, everybody agrees with that, we do need to bring private investors, private financing, capital markets into these enormous transitions we're going through. How do we accelerate the maturing of these markets? How do we incentivize capital on a scale that perhaps a few years ago would have been unthinkable, but now needs to be deployed? And I think the institutions of our international development and finance architecture now essentially are under scrutiny. If they cannot be that accelerator, then they become marginal to what happens next.
One of the next key moments in the global financing conversation will take place next year in Spain at the Financing for Development Conference. 10 years after the last iteration in Addis Ababa, the convening will be an important moment for agreeing on how the Sustainable Development Goals and climate commitments will be financed moving forward. I asked Achim Steiner how the preparations are going and what's likely to be on the agenda.
You know, I could give you a negotiator's answer now, but let me speak more frankly. I think, first of all, we need to return to the negotiating table with a sense of shared and common interest, and also more respect, because I think one of the things that has not evolved from where we were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, is that we today live in a world where developing countries and taxpayers in developing countries are investing as much, if not more, in addressing climate change, poverty reduction, pandemic preparedness, as the taxpayers of the classic donor OECD countries. And the sad truth is that, you know, the OECD countries have not seized the opportunity over the last decade or two to move towards a 0.7 target in terms of the amount of money that they would invest in advancing development globally, but also the global public goods that serve everyone. The harsh truth is that many countries have cut back their financing at a critical moment in time, the most vulnerable moment for many developing countries, and what they have seen is donors walk away. And the OECD average is still around 0.37%. If we genuinely believe that that is enough money to tackle the great risks to our collective security, but also to national security. Because everybody talks about defense and national security as if those territorial threats from a neighbor or an invasion are the most existential threats of the 21st century. They are real, they exist in some context, but every think tank, every analyst who talks about the great risks of our time puts completely different risks at the forefront. The risk of cybercrime and cyber warfare, the next pandemic, inequality that is driving polarization and radicalization, economic implosion, the disappointment in an international system that seems to at one moment care very much about one country, but the next minute couldn't care less about another. These are, in a sense, the great risks to addressing the financing for development. We live in a 21st century where economies need to advance together. Unfortunately, as we showed in the latest UNDP Human Development Report, after about 20 years of convergence, we seem to be entering a period possibly of divergence again, which means low-income countries, least developed countries, those that are not able to recover, they don't have the finance, so they're indebted, they can't invest in the big transitions, be it energy or digital, are essentially locked into a very low growth and recovery pathway. The wealthier ones can invest in these transformative technologies, become energy independent with renewables, can create entire digital empires, as we have seen in a corporate sense. This is a dangerous moment, and that's why the Financing for Development Conference next year is to some extent about numbers and particular programs, but it is also about understanding how dependent we are on one another. And I think this is my perhaps greatest concern. We have lost confidence in one another, and the public in many countries does not necessarily believe that there is something good coming out of these investments, particularly in the traditional donor countries. We have lost, let's say, the debate over why is it worthwhile investing in a country that you may never visit in your life, but whose decisions, actions may fundamentally affect the future of your children. That's a conversation that I hope we will rediscover and, in a sense, create for the 21st century in the lead up to that conference.
Thanks for listening to Devex at the World Bank and IMF meetings, a special edition of This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, or you can leave us a rating or review. We'd also love to hear from you if you have any feedback or want to get in touch. You can find me on social media at @advasal or send an email to podcast@devex.com. Devex at the World Bank and IMF meetings is hosted by me, Adva Saldinger. Today's episode was edited by Mai Yilagan.